Sustain267.
Welcome to Sustain267, where we host conversations with Africans about climate change, sustainability, and environmental justice in Botswana and the rest of Africa. I am your host, Bertha Foundation. This is our fourth episode of the Disinformation, Development, and Fossil Fuel series, and our very last one in Botswana. In the previous episodes, we looked into the disinformation that fossil fuels will develop Africa. Then we looked into the power and politics behind this message, who spreads it, and how. In the most recent episode, we unpacked finances and we shared who bankrolls these projects, who bears the costs, and who gets the profits. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, I highly recommend you listen to them and then you come right back here. Today's episode, we focus on climate change and the environment. We are still in the small village of Medie, which is located in Botswana, focusing on Medie Limited's Masama Coal mine, a project that's been promoted as a beacon of development, but in reality is contributing to environmental degradation and increased climate vulnerability. We'll unpack how profits and the dream of development have been prioritized over people and the environment in the face of the climate crisis by Botswana's continued growth of coal mining. Here is the president of Botswana, Mokgweetsi Masisi, speaking to the paradox that Botswana finds itself in as a developing country faced with the climate crisis, with fossil fuels under our feet.
The challenges that many nation states are faced with. That's to do with how we adapt and how we manage to reduce the risk that's associated with development. And a lot of it is to do with the amount of CO2 we emit to the air, which is a threat to our environmental ecosystem. We've been heavily dependent on thermal power production, which is a lot of abundant coal reserves, which drives our domestic economy and drives our industrial agenda. We, in the developing world, suffer the most of the worst of those.
While he made valid points and the promises of economic growth and development are really tempting, at what cost? And can we truly afford to pursue development while sacrificing our environment? That's the question we'll be exploring today, with a specific focus on how disinformation around fossil fuels is keeping Africa on the wrong developmental path in the face of the climate crisis. Let's start by understanding what's happening at the Masama Coal mine, which is owned by Botswana Stock Exchange-listed company Medie. It's been sold as a game changer for Botswana's coal industry, and sometimes even referred to as clean coal. It's even been sold as an economic boost for rural communities like Medie. But when you dig a little deeper, the narrative starts to shift. Botswana is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, such as rising temperatures, erratic rainfall, and prolonged droughts, which already have become our reality, with some of the worst that we've seen to date being Cyclone Dineo in 2017, which the infrastructural damage from still to date has not been fixed, and the increase in the frequency of heat waves. 5 heat waves were declared between February 2024 and March 2024 by the Department of Meteorology in Botswana. And while all of this is happening, Botswana is experiencing the return of the climate phenomenon El Nino, which in 2015 resulted in one of the worst drought periods we have ever experienced. That drought nearly dried the Gaborone Dam, which provides water to a lot of households, and hit lows of 7%. During El Nino, we also saw drastically reduced crop and livestock production, risking the food security of Botswana. All this, according to climate scientists, is exacerbated by fossil fuel projects like Masama Coal Mine. This is Mr. Kiabile Khalerwa, a climatologist at the University of Botswana, giving us a bit of a peek into what exactly is Botswana's climate reality.
Botswana is the same as the country. It has got same wet and hot summers and dry, cool winters. And it also got a very high level of rainfall availability. And that makes Botswana the warmest, the second driest country in Southern Africa. It's one of the world's most drought-prone countries. Since 1950, it has been experiencing multiple multi-year droughts which have been recorded. It has got adverse impacts on agricultural production, in water resources, in both urban and rural landscapes. And it also impairs the rural economy and social-cultural structures. And now, currently, because Botswana had reliable on climate-sensitive livelihoods, which include agriculture and varied products harvesting, and we also got an issue of economic diversification at national levels, and which means that opportunities for adaptation tend to be much lower than you would expect for any country. This is going to impact heavily on agriculture and livestock production and water availability. I think those are the two sectors really which are hard hit by climate change. And all government programs to mitigate the impacts, they should target mainly those two sectors most. So because climate is changing, Botswana is becoming warmer and drier. Well, we all know that. You may also maybe realize that currently we're at 1.4 degrees Celsius in terms of temperature rise. They're supposed to put a ceiling 1.5. The extreme weather events, that's also where we need a bit of resilience there, adaptation to all those, because we can't prevent them, but at least to be in a position that will allow us to be able to adapt to some of these extreme weather events. And of course, there's also need to increase adaptive capacity in order to achieve climate resilience. And we also need to subsist on climate-proof initiatives or livelihoods, which involve investing more on climate-resilient livelihoods and reduce dependence on rain-fed agricultural systems. And then, of course, you also need to have a sustainable development policy shift. We need to mainstream climate change into sustainable development plans. I'm sure for now, the Department of Environmental Protection, I think they've moved a bit into mainstreaming climate change in all environmental impact assessments for any projects that people want to embark on. And they also, the Ministry of Minerals Energy, they've got this ERP program, which involves renewable energy transitions. And lastly, maybe something that you also need to do is to diversify economy so that we really move away from this climate-sensitive livelihoods.
According to Botswana's 2021 climate change policy, the country's greenhouse gas emissions contribute about 5% of Africa's total emissions, which contributes approximately 4% of global emissions. And yet, despite our vulnerability to climate change, which is driven by the burning of fossil fuels, we continue to heavily rely on coal for electricity and energy. The mining operations, while they can make money and be potentially profitable, emit substantial amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, two of the most potent greenhouse gases. Still looking at the Botswana climate change policy, according to Botswana's climate change policy, Botswana has committed to a low-carbon development pathway and aims to reduce its emissions by 15% by 2030. Yet, coal production remains at the center of the country's energy strategy. The contradictions are mind-boggling. Let's take a listen to some of them. While we look at the messages, we'll also highlight where the contradictions are.
Botswana's present and future path to industrialization is premised on the conviction that industrial development should lead to value addition in the form of mineral beneficiation and manufacturing, and most importantly, sustainable and inclusive growth. As the world transitions to a greener future, the prospects for a prosperous Africa have never been better or brighter.
Actually, in the presence of the future past, Africa's future is rather precarious, looking at we are situated, according to the IPCC, in sub-Saharan Africa, which will be the worst affected by the climate crisis, considering how slow we are to adapt and our high vulnerability.
I wish to state affirmatively that Africa can no longer be the sole savior of the world by merely exporting her raw materials, an experiment that has failed to deliver the prosperity that her citizens desire.
Which begs the question of, where does Masama Coal Mine fit in a present where we know that Africa cannot be the sole savior of the world by merely exporting our materials, and Masama Coal Mine exports all the materials that they mine? It's an experiment that has failed to deliver, like the president said. Why are we continuing with it?
I do agree that climate change should be a top priority for us and ensure the inclusion in global climate action of all these nations. I share the view that there is need for the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibility, and respective capabilities to be applied when dealing with issues of climate change and development. With these,
Definitely.
my country, Botswana, we're making significant strides towards transitioning from coal-fired electricity to renewable energy. Botswana also seeks support through the Loss and Damage Fund, which is established to address the irreversible impact and losses caused by climate change, which cannot be prevented or adequately addressed through adaptation measures alone. We share concerns of developing countries of inadequate funding climate change actions, especially financial resources dedicated to supporting our countries in their climate mitigation and adaptation efforts.
Which again begs the question, Botswana as a developing country, knowing the effects of loss and damage, we're not reading about them, we're seeing them in real time. We was hit by Cyclone Dineo, and some of the infrastructure that was damaged then to date has still not been repaired due to lack of resources. We know what the impact will be of the climate crisis on us. Why then do we put money behind industries that will make these extreme weather events more frequent and have Dineo visiting us more frequently too?
All of us, climate vulnerable countries, keeping the 1.5 degree limit alive and getting a fair deal on adaptation, financing at the top of our priority list. Many of our people are already suffering severe losses and damages from ever more extreme climate impacts. Progress towards achieving our ambitions for sustainable development is quickly slipping away. We need a dramatic shift in the focus of global climate action and climate finance to protect our people's right to remain in their homes.
And with this commitment, Botswana and Medie village in particular is a great place to practice charity begins at home. We need to protect people's rights to remain in their homes, and we've got the opportunity to do that in Medie, where people's houses can be protected and their health can be protected. Actually, let's use it as a pilot of how do we make this work in the way that protects people in the face of industry.
In this regard, we're very pleased with the launch of the Community's Climate Adaptation Facility. The CCAF is designed to provide quick impact grants to affect communities so they can address their most pressing needs and become more resilient. Third, the rights of persons forcibly displaced by climate impact must be upheld, whether they move within their countries or across border. Our people and communities should be a priority of our climate action.
From country commitments to people's realities. We, as Botswana, are perpetuating and contributing to a problem that, as a sub-Saharan African country, is the biggest threat to our continued development and even erasing some of the progress already made. We're contributing to the biggest threat to sustainable development that the president shares that we're aiming to achieve. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body for assessing climate science, was created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessment of climate change, its implications, and future risks. And they share that sub-Saharan Africa has only contributed 1% of historical cumulative global emissions. This brings up the argument that, considering that Africa has contributed the least, next to nothing really, then it must be allowed the most carbon budget to pollute on its industrialization and developmental pathway. The complication is that although we contributed the least to the problem, we are predicted to be the worst affected because of our geographical location and our high vulnerability, or even lack of adequate preparation for the impact of extreme weather events. This is acknowledged under the common but differentiated responsibilities and differing responsibilities of individual countries in addressing and responding to climate change. By continuing on the coal for development pathway, we contribute to the increase of carbon emissions globally that increase the probability of extreme weather events and that may have terrible impacts on the lives of people in Africa, which in the village of Medie specifically may look like floods that wash away people's ailing bodies from TB who are in houses with cracks due to mine blasting, droughts that do away with people's livestock and crops, which a lot of them is their only means of income, and even tropical diseases and lung diseases when they only have access to a single health post locally. Let's start by looking at houses, which can be viewed as building resilience to the hard climate, which are now under threat as shared in the next clip from our interview with the Village Development Council chairperson. And a note for clarity, when she mentions JCON, it's the previous mining contractor that has since left, and the one that has replaced it is Meropa.
So tota our homes are cracking because of the blasting at the mine. When people go to them, they make promises to come. Since JCON, they've been promising to address it, and now Meropa is in and has replaced JCON. We've even had the Member of Parliament, Honorable Naniki Magwinja, do a walk around with her team, looking at the damage, but they did not help in any way. Crops don't perform like before. The dust is killing the crops. It's not like before. When you go near the mine, you will see the trees. You will see that the trees are dead and that the grass is also dead. We suspect it's the dust from the mine. We were never told anything about the coal being bad for the environment. They told us they would suppress the dust and that we would never hear the blasting. But now our houses have cracked and there is dust everywhere. Me, the white man, told us that we would not feel any of these things that we're feeling now. They didn't tell us anything about coal harming the environment and all that. Nothing at all.
The Medie Environmental Impact Assessment Report for Masama Coal Mine identified several significant environmental risks, including groundwater depletion, air pollution, and biodiversity loss. These aren't minor issues. They're existential threats to communities dependent on these resources, which will be made worse by the climate impacts, as I've just mentioned. Think about this for a moment. We're told that coal mining will bring development, yet the people living closest to these mines are also highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change due to low climate resilience. The development in this case hasn't happened. But let's say it does. Does it justify the coal extraction and environmental damage? In episode 1, we explored how the disinformation narrative of fossil fuels being key to Africa's development has been pushed repeatedly to the point where it's acceptable as truth. Looking at a project like Masama Coal Mine, can we really say the benefits outweigh the costs of these so-called developments? And when those developments are eroded by floods, what then? Does it still count as development in absentia? Coal mining has significant environmental consequences, particularly in rural communities like Medie, which are close to mining sites. The International Renewable Energy Agency's Botswana Renewable Readiness Assessment from the year 2021 shows that Botswana's energy sector remains heavily reliant on fossil fuels, with fossil fuels accounting for over 90% of the total energy supply. This over-reliance on fossil fuels exacerbates environmental degradation. The Masama Coal Mine has been shown to contribute to increased water scarcity, pollution, and land degradation in Medie. And according to residents of Medie, dust from the mine has significantly reduced agricultural productivity, and the mine's extremely deep boreholes have caused their shallower domestic boreholes to run dry. The EIA for Masama Coal mine noted potential risks, but the mitigation measures implemented by Medie have been insufficient to say the least. One of the major concerns highlighted in the EIA is groundwater depletion. We know that mining uses tons and tons of water. This is an area in a region where water scarcity is already an issue. Significant air pollution risks due to coal dust have also led to increased respiratory problems in nearby communities, as shared by the Khosi in this clip.
There's a smell that we live with from the mine. The smell, we don't know how it has affected us. We once asked about it in a meeting and they said it's from a chemical they use to wash in the mine. We don't know how it affects our health. Then there are TB cases. I once asked at the health post if they have an increase in TB cases, and they said that since the mine started, there has been an increase. The main challenge is the dust. Dust from the road when trucks pass, which is visible, and from the mine, which is not visible. Dust from the road when trucks pass, which is visible, and from the mine, which is not as visible. The one from the mine you see in the house when you try to maybe use a white plate. When you wipe it, you will find black soot on it. Crops have been affected. They are not doing as well as before, especially the farms between the Medie and Lensolitao villages where the trucks pass. Some who used to grow crops on the farms along the road have given up. Even you, I'm sure you didn't see anything growing when you drove there. There was nothing for you to see.
And then when we look at the Medie report on environmental sustainability, they report an improvement in water efficiency and dust suppression. Speaking to the people of Medie, we know their initiatives like dust suppression and even litter picking exercises are just not enough. Botswana has made international commitments under the Paris Agreement and its own 2021 climate change policy to pursue sustainable development and to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. The policy states that Botswana's vision is to be a low-carbon, climate-resilient society by 2036, with the renewable energy making up 15% of the energy mix by 2030. That's in just 6 years. Currently, we're at over 95% of fossil fuels in our energy mix, with less than 1% being from renewable energy. The government's own integrated resource plan calls for a transition to renewable energy, yet coal continues to dominate the energy mix. The IRP projects show that renewables will only make up for 15% of the energy mix by 2030, and even that target, experts argue, is way too low for Botswana given its renewable energy potential. Masama Coal mine and its funding from the government of nearly 400 million pula, nearly $30 million, is a contradiction to these goals. The country's continued growing dependence on coal extraction is at odds with its commitments to climate action. Instead of investing more heavily in solar, a resource that Botswana has in abundance, coal mining continues to expand at a financial and environmental loss to the country. How does coal fit into the mentioned national grid, and how is this development for Botswana? One would think if we're looking to reduce the fossil fuels in our energy mix from over 95% to 85% in 6 years, would be investing less in fossil fuel and more in the renewable energy we say we wish to increase from 1 to 15%. Botswana's solar energy potential is one of the highest in the world, And the reliance on coal is holding the country back from fully embracing an energy-secure, sustainably developed future. On one hand, we're making global commitments, and on the other, we're investing in coal. How do we reconcile these two positions? Now talk money and resource allocation, because at the end of the day, it often comes down to profit versus people. Medie's 2023 Integrated Annual Report shows significant revenue from its operations at the Masama Coal mine. But how much of that money is being invested into the communities most affected by the environmental damage and being proactive about the climate crisis before the worst of it hits? Medie Limited generated over 425 million in revenue in the year 2022. According to their annual report, despite this revenue, they posted a pre-tax loss of 176 million pula, with much of its coal exported to South Africa and other international markets. Meanwhile, the community of Medie has seen little to no developments. So, coal and energy for international markets, revenue for Medie Limited, and environmental pollution and climate crisis impacts for the residents of Medie. Everybody gets something, I guess. And as a bonus, Medie residents even have gotten cracks in their houses from the blasting done with the dynamites in the mine. The Botswana government is complicit in this prioritization of profit over environmental sustainability and people. And this is why we need to ask ourselves some hard questions here. If the profits from coal mining aren't being invested in the communities that bear the environmental costs, where are they going? Who are they developing? And more importantly, why are we allowing this to continue? The argument that coal will lift these communities out of poverty is clearly flawed. Instead, it's the environment and the local population that are left to deal with the fallout. And as we discussed earlier in episode 2, the Medie community has never received the benefits from these projects as promised. But there's hope. Botswana has immense potential for renewable energy, particularly solar. With over 300 days of sunshine a year, Botswana is well positioned to be a leader in clean energy across Africa. Botswana's solar energy potential is estimated to be one of the highest in the world. If harnessed, this could not only meet domestic demand, but also allow Botswana to become a net importer of clean energy in the long run, with technological advancements, of course. Research by the International Renewable Energy Agency. The shift away from the path of fossil fuels for development requires political will and a focus on long-term sustainability over short-term profits. Communities like Medie should be able to develop, have access to energy, and have their health and wealth to enjoy these developments. So let's think about this for a minute. We're sitting on one of the richest solar resources in the world. We're also sitting in a region that is one of the most vulnerable and in danger to the impacts of the climate crisis, which is mostly caused by the burning of fossil fuels like coal. Yet, we continue to invest in coal. Why? How? Could the message that it is our only pathway to development have something to do with it? That strengthened by the argument that we as Botswana and Africa have to use our pollution budget, even though it will exacerbate how we'll be impacted by climate change. As we come to the end of our visit and stay in Medie, Masama Coal Mine serves as a clear example of how the belief that fossil fuels, such as coal, will develop Africa is a successful misinformation campaign that has been perpetuated by those who stand to profit at the lowest possible cost to themselves, while exploiting loopholes in policies, telling lies and making false promises, and taking advantage of the nature of vulnerable rural communities of Botswana, whose culture is rooted in both trust, respect, and botho. This leaves them open to disinformation from fossil fuel companies who promise development and deliver anything but. To end off on a contradiction, as has been the running theme for this series so far, one last time, here is the President of Botswana with words to remember.
I wish to state affirmatively that Africa can no longer be the sole savior of the world by merely exporting her raw materials, an experiment that has failed to deliver the prosperity that her citizens desire.
As we look ahead, we need to commit to advancing the truth of communities who've been victims of this disinformation campaign. As individuals and collectives in our spaces, we need to amplify truth and stories and to guard against communities from falling victim to this trap. In the next episode, we are off to the second country of the series, the coastal Mozambique. We take a journey there to look into the Fossil Fuels Will Develop Africa disinformation campaign and what it looks like there. Join us as we pop into Maputo and travel up to Bemba, the capital city of the Cabo Delgado district. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustain267 Podcast. Find a list of sources used for this episode in the episode description. Don't forget to subscribe to the Sustain267 Podcast channel on whatever platform you are listening on so you are the first to know when the next episode drops. I am the host of Sustain267 Podcast, Bertha Foundation, and the sound engineer is Maleho Makoti. Let's connect on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram on our handle at Sustain267 and continue the conversation. This series is part of my work as a Bertha Foundation Fellow hosted by the Botswana Society for Human Development. Take care.
Sustain267.